Vaalmikki Arjoon is here with us this morning because there are a lot of eyes. I know, especially the business community is just sitting, waiting to see what's going to happen. AmCham wants a national recovery fund. Chamber wants some serious incentives to the business community, using up the money that are just sitting in the bank, they're idle. And I realize that the population who wants back pay, everybody wants something. And this is a time where we kind of learn what the government's position is on moving the country forward. So good morning to you, Vaalmikki Arjoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. Good morning, Natalie. And good morning to all your viewers, and thank you for having me on the show this morning.
So bigger budget. I mean, I always start with we have COVID. We have COVID. We had some depressed oil and gas prices for a good little bit. Things seem to be rebounding now where that is concerned. But then we have less production. So then that's another issue. And then we have all of this borrowing that we've done. But there's no revenue authority as yet, and we know of the issues with the BIR and customs and excise. So just what kind of budget are we looking for, or should we expect?
All right, so we remember we've not gone through just one lockdown. We've gone through two lockdowns, and these lockdowns weren't just for the space of a few weeks. These were several in both years. These were several months on end. So that, of course, would have put the economy, particularly more so the private sector, in a great deal of financial stress. Now, what we have to really appreciate is that the government is in a real catch-22 situation here. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. There's no two ways about this. This is probably, for this particular administration, since they came into government in 2015, you think every year is going to be a difficult budget. But this is probably, they're going to have the most difficult time, the most difficult job on their hands to prepare the budget. Because remember, a budget is not just about making the figures look good, what your revenues are, what your expenditures are. We want to make our revenue streams look good. That's not just what the budget is about. That's just a very tiny part of the equation. A budget has to represent a plan, a proper detailed outline of a national plan that is going to promote economic welfare for the citizens, not just for the coming year, but for the years after that, for the short to the medium term, well into the long term. Right? How are we going to improve our access to basic amenities like healthcare? And we've seen how important that is over these last 18 months or so. How are we going to provide better educational facilities, both online and physical infrastructure? How are we going to provide better housing, better potable water, access to electricity, Wi-Fi, and the list goes on and on. How are we going to better, and what is critical at this stage is how the government plans to better manage their very scarce financial resources in terms of better procurement and more focus into the more critical areas of expenditure, which in my view has always really been the more productive side, which is capital expenditure. Now, you would appreciate that over these last 5 years, the last 5 fiscal years, excluding fiscal 2021, we would have had a fiscal deficit of about $48 billion. That meant we spent $48 billion more than what we actually earned in revenues. And based on the central bank's forecasted figure for the deficit this year, we're going to go we'll probably likely find another deficit of about $16 billion. That is going to take the fiscal deficit, the total 6-year deficit, to $63 billion. So we would have probably spent $63 billion more than what we earned in revenue. So of course, with those kinds of figures, you have no choice. You have to borrow. And we're not the only economy all over the world that would have had to incur additional debt. Our debt to GDP ratio, the last figure provided by the central bank, was about 85%. My estimates tell me by now it'll probably be about 87%. But lucky for us, we had we were able to fall back on some of the funds, the finances from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Now, a big part of recovery in terms of the revenue side of things is going to depend on how successful our revenue collections are, not just in this fiscal year, but going forward from this fiscal year. And that is where the organization like the TTRA would come into play. And secondly, and in my view, more importantly, the recovery of the private sector. What we're seeing so far is that there's been, you hear things like a V-shaped recovery or L-shaped recovery. What's happening now is a K-shaped recovery. So when you look at a K, the upper half of it is upward sloping. So that would represent the increase or surge in the spending, the pent-up demand then for those who would have been able to keep their income from last year and this year. They stayed in their jobs. They were lucky enough to retain their jobs. And because they were not able to spend so much last year and even this year, they want to make up for that loss in spending. So there's a surge in their expenditure right now. But then the lower half of the K, which we have to appreciate, is it could very well be a significant percentage of the population. Many of these households would have lost their jobs or faced cuts in income in some form or the other. So their purchasing power is not as great as we would have liked it to be and the way it was in the past. So their spending would have slowed down quite significantly in many cases, and it will take time to recover. So the private sector, having closed down for 2 consecutive periods in 2 years, they of course would face a serious strain in their cash flows, financial stress. So going forward, the state needs to work together with the private sector to come up with various ways to reinvigorate activities in the private sector. And the only way you're going to do that is, by and large, increasing the purchasing power of the citizens as a whole, because you need these citizens to go and spend their monies in the private sector.
Vaalmikki, you've raised some excellent points, and I don't even know if I'm going to get through all of them. You're probably going to have to make your answers to my questions a little brief. But the first one I think I heard was that, where we seem to generate monies from capital expenditure, when we put money onto that in that side into those projects where you can get some kind of economic activity going. But we have a government and we have a system that has a lot of transfers and subsidies, and a lot of that goes into social services. So are you then suggesting that for this year, based on what we know about the amount of people who've lost jobs, even if we don't know the actual figures, we know that with the 2 lockdowns that there are a lot of people who are jobless. So therefore it means that there are going to be less tax to be collected. We know that there are issues with the procurement legislation, and we're looking at what you say might be a $63 billion budget deficit over the 6 years. So then how does the government go into capital expenditure and not treat with the social services that seem to be so needed at this time with the amount of...
You're correct. It is very much needed, and the government has to strike the right balance in terms of still providing not just the social services that they would have provided over these last few years, but remember, there's an additional element to that. There are those who have been made extremely vulnerable economically and socially due to the fallout from COVID. So in this particular budget, they are likely to have no choice but to continue to provide some form of COVID relief. It's all about striking the right balance. But you see, what countries like us are very guilty of is that when we earn these windfall of energy revenues, we earned about $291 billion in energy revenues over the last 15 years alone. That's just 15 years. But a large chunk of those monies were really spent on the transfers and subsidies that you're referring to. Over the last decade, on average, each year, we spend about 17 or 18% of our GDP goes on transfers and subsidies. But when you look at the capital expenditure side, which is the more productive avenue of government expenditure, it's just really a meager 3.47%. But capital expenditure is that avenue of expenditure in the budget that is what is going to create additional job opportunities, additional productivity in the economy, and link businesses together. So let's say, for example, this is actually one of my favorites that they've had on the books for a few years, and I'm very eager to see it be completed, is the Labre dry docking facility. Because with respect to all these surge in industrial activities that is happening in Guyana, we are very well poised in terms of our location of that port to provide ship repair and shipping services as a whole to those vessels that will be going to Guyana and by extension the wider South American subcontinent. So that is one avenue of capital expenditures on the books that could very well provide us with an increased amount of foreign exchange that we so desperately need.
But do you believe that the population is aware enough of just the difficulty of what the government is going through and trying to do that balance of, okay, you are not working, I can give you a little stipend or a little grant, but if I withhold that grant and put it towards capital expenditure, the chances of you being able to sustain yourself going forward is much greater. Do you think the
Right.
government prepare a
Well,
budget and
some
populate
some of them in the
funds?
population, you see, you have to be very careful in terms of withholding that social expenditure. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is what they do at this point in time. What we have to appreciate is that for many, many years, some individuals that acquire these social benefits may not necessarily deserve it. And a good example of that is the food card program. And they have discussed that, the state has discussed that many times, where they
No,
would
and
come
we've
out and
seen a huge cut too. We've seen since this government came in some
they
kind of,
started to rationalize
yes,
some
we've
of
seen
these programs, right?
rationalization of that.
So one has to continue, a government, any government will have to continue better financial management practices. This is where issues such as better procurement comes into play, and not just that, better financial management practices across all the ministries, across the board. So, for example, you look at how much money do you spend in administrative services each year in the various ministries, and look to see if you could cut that down so you can allocate some of those funds, instead of in the administrative side, to the more production side of things. So it's just, that's just
And you
one
know what,
of many examples that they need to do.
while I hear
But
you, while I hear you on that point, then it raises the question of when you get to those ministries, the first thing you hear is understaffed. So therefore, if it is understaffed, you're wondering if they are to really staff it, if the administrative costs won't go up more. So how do you balance getting the right personnel in, having the amount of personnel that you need, and cutting that administrative budget? All
right,
at the same
so
time with everything else that going around with COVID, with the unemployment, with poverty might be well on the rise. You know, there are so many variables that we
yeah.
have to take into consideration. So I'm wondering now, do you believe the minister will come with a bigger budget just because of the amount of monies it has expended over the last year just treating with COVID?
Yeah, I don't think he will come with a bigger budget per se. I think if it's bigger, it may probably be bigger by about a couple of $1 billion at best. Simply because we simply don't have the monies. Now, one thing COVID, the pandemic has shown us, has forced us to become more cognizant of, is the use of technology in order to carry about our day-to-day lives and our day-to-day business. Can you imagine if the ministries, all of them, were to embrace the use of working from online, not necessarily every single day of the week, but at least half of the week? You would avoid issues like heavy traffic, etc. on the road. But more importantly, if you're working from home, that negates the necessity to be renting, for example, spending millions of dollars each month on renting properties that do not belong to the government to house ministries. That's money saved right there. But you're using the online facilities to be able to carry on your daily procedures, and you're doing it as fast as possible. And that takes us to the ease of doing business. Because remember, the private sector has to interact with the public service in order to get certain things done. Like, for example, get your import licenses, submit your import documents, pay your customs duties, etc. What if you could do all of these things online? That would speed up the business processes in the country, reduce the need for cumbersome public sector bureaucracy, and at the same time build confidence among the private sector. But we're missing a very big link here in terms of the revenue collections, and that is where the revenue authority, or the tax administrative body
You
in
know
the
what?
country comes into
Because
play.
because the government had to make changes so that it wouldn't need a three-fifths majority, of course, the Public Service Commission still has the role of dealing with enforcement. So
Correct.
now the question becomes if it's going to be efficient enough, if we have the Ministry of the Finance managing, well, the board managing, tax administration and human resource, and then the Public Service Commission managing enforcement. But as you said, we need to make some changes because obviously where we aren't getting the kind of results. I think, honestly, I have seen a lot of effort from this government, but with the systems that are in place, it's difficult and it's going to take some
Correct. Yeah.
time.
So
We
so
have a
we
we have a procurement legislation, and while it might not be what everybody wants, is that we have something. We have the TTRA that was approved in the upper house. Let's see when it goes to the lower house, what will happen there. But I'm saying, and you spoke about the dry docking facility, that is an opportunity as well. So there are things that are being done. We talk about the digitalization so that the ease of doing business you can have those things, a lot online services. But I know for a fact that even with this budget, even with the announcement, we won't get everything that we hear in it in year one. We still haven't gotten the liberalization of fuel. We still haven't gotten the sale of NP gas stations. We still haven't gotten the privatization of the Port of Spain. But I know I think some kind of tender or something went out for that. But I'm saying that we realize that things take time. So what happens in the medium term when you have so many people who are on the breadline? You have the business community who is saying, listen, we need some incentives, we need a break, because if we are not liquid, if we don't get those VAT returns,
Yeah,
it's almost
that actually I
impossible
would like
for us.
to get into. That's a very, very important point. You see, from the revenue authority side, or you could call it the BIR, the revenue authority, whatever the case is, the bottom line is that on the revenue authority, for tax administration in the country, it has been for many, many years afflicted with several issues. For example, the BIR is heavily understaffed. You have some divisions there that only have about 10 or 20% staffing. And there's a very high labor turnover. People come and in the space of a few months, they leave onto another job. So you have to spend money to continuously train people when they come in. And they need to start embracing the use of more technology to be able to capture those more of those individuals that really ought to be in the tax bracket and collect them their fair share of taxation. And the list could go on and on. And then now the Revenue Authority proposes to be really a combo or a hybrid of the BIR and Customs being another entity that has their fair share of inefficiencies as well. But the bottom line is that now it is urgent. It is actually really urgent, and that is not exaggerating by any means possible. It is urgent to plug the holes in the taxation system. But in addition to that, there's the other side of things where there's the private sector who is really struggling. They're still owed a lot of money in the VAT refunds. But we would have heard several times mentioned that since last year, one of the fiscal initiatives for the COVID relief that the state would have provided is in partnership with the commercial banks is the SME loan facility from the commercial banks. Now that still has been severely underutilized because you have in one situation banks adhering to certain standards that they would have traditionally adhered to. We have a very conservative banking sector in TNT. So they're very highly capitalized. There's about $8.3 billion in excess liquidity sitting there. That's money just sitting there doing nothing except collecting a smidgen of interest every single year. Those are monies that could be put to better use. Now, here's the government saying, okay, we will provide 100% of the repayment. We would take on 100% of the risk then, instead of the banks having to take on that risk. So if the client, the SME that takes the loan, cannot repay it, then we would have to step in and repay it for you. So that's all the risk that is mitigated right there. In that case, why are businesses still not able to access them?
Yet it is still underutilized. So then what is the issue? Because you're not bearing the risk of it. I mean, but you're still taking
right. So remember that banks adhere to certain standards, whereby if you want to qualify for a loan, first of all, you must be a registered business. And we're well aware that there are many businesses that are outside the tax bracket that really ought to be paying taxes, but they're not because they are not registered businesses. So that's one factor. Another factor is that even if you are registered, there are many small and micro companies that don't really keep proper financial records. And of course, banks need this to make a fair financial decision as to whether they should take a risk on giving you a loan.